Hi, everyone. Welcome to AI in the Classroom Daily. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, co-founder, chief academic officer here at Newsella. Thanks for taking a few minutes with us to talk about AI in the classroom. And over the weekend, I got a text from a good friend of mine, Chris Lehman, who's the founder and principal of Science Leadership Academy in Philly. And he wanted to know what I thought of his latest blog writing on his blog, Practical Theory, which I highly encourage you check out when you have a minute. And his article is about wrestling with AI now 3 years in since the launch of GPT in November of 2022. And he starts by asserting that it's not going well since this launch as far as schools are concerned. And I wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about his perspective and give you a couple of takeaways, my perspective on his perspective. And I think it's a super interesting article. Highly recommend that you read it. I think one of the things that I'm mindful of, even as I respond to Chris's blog, is, as he asserts, there's sort of two camps illustrated by Greg Topo's recent piece, two camps on AI in education, those who are steadfastly against the use of AI and are proposing methods that take us further from AI and in some cases further from technology overall. And then there are others who say that this is the advent of something truly revolutionary. For the first time, we actually have the potential to fulfill the promise of technology, the idea of personalized learning, the idea of adaptive instruction, meeting kids where they are and scaffolding at the right moments and letting students pursue what they're truly interested in a way that hasn't been possible previously. And as he notes, a lot of the commentators who are the cheerleaders of AI are actually not in the classroom on a daily basis, and I'm one of them. But I'm not a cheerleader, I would say, for AI, but I recognize that what I'm going to tell you is based on my experience in and out of classrooms over the last several decades. But the last time I was a classroom teacher, I was still reckoning with the meaning of the internet, let alone AI. There are a couple of things that strike me about Chris's writing here. I wanted to raise those. I mentioned sort of two camps here regarding the approaches to the use of AI. And I want to just talk briefly about this camp that is staunchly anti-AI, the idea of moving off screens entirely. And for me, I would say the promise of AI is potentially to finally unlock assessment in a more dynamic way. I think one of the things that I've seen over the last couple of decades in education technology is that the places where the adaptive learning, personalized learning, one student, one machine, and the machine is on a gradual release setting with students, helping them along where they need help and pushing them where they should be pushed. That's been happening in places where you could write sort of computational rules for the software. So places that this tends to be prevalent up until now have been areas such as early literacy, where you can assess for phonemic awareness, for phonics, and for decoding for the early building blocks of literacy. We've seen rotational models with software doing that. We've also seen it in mathematics, where for a while Khan Academy had a Google map of math, which could actually show you and situate your learner profile in the context of the map of math to understand what the dependencies were. If you understood addition, maybe you were then ready for multiplication. If you were having difficulty on a diagnostic on division, perhaps you needed to go back to multiplication to understand some of the relationships and numbers and so forth. And then also language acquisition. We've seen language apps since some of the very earliest personalized learning has been around teaching world languages. Again, because in the way that the software can write, it can be programmed to assess in very discrete ways and to sequence learning. If you understand this, you're ready for this. If you don't, you need to go back to these pillars. And for me, the real unlock of AI potentially is in creating a space for more dynamic and responsive assessments, moving away from strictly multiple choice. I think it still will have a place, but it won't necessarily be the default. And part of my interest in AI has been in writing, because I think writing is such a brilliant way to capture expression and thought and help students both practice their expression and also develop their understanding of their content knowledge, and to build that understanding through the content and by developing their own voice. I could go off on that. But one of the great disappointments for me is that, as Chris points out in his blog, the promise of, he doesn't really talk so much about the promise of assessment, but the prevalence of cheating. And I can't help but reflect on the fact that with our ability now to assess student writing with AI, it may also be tied intimately to the fact that the AI can produce student writing, produce writing of all kinds in great volumes. And as Chris says, we're not going to be able to lesson plan our way out of this. There will be a limit to the number of ways that we can come up with ingenious and innovative ways to maintain students' interest. And as he says, there isn't going to be a lesson that is interesting for all students all the time. And so there's always going to be this kind of temptation to offload cognitive work to AI, and it's never been easier. And I think that's what Chris is wrestling with here, that despite, I think, some of the best teaching that I've seen and one of the best schools I've visited, even here at what I would consider some of the forefront of teaching and learning practices and institutional wisdom and conscience, this is a community that's still very much wrestling with this. And I think one of the takeaways, and Chris, I think, is open sourcing his work as always, is the principle of transparency. In a case where things are so unsteady and everyone's trying to get their bearings, and at any moment students could be using an AI when they're not supposed to. And we talked about this a little bit when we were discussing this book by Tony Frontier last week, talking about the potential for misalignment between what the student thinks the assignment is and what the teacher thinks the assignment is. And when the student, let's say, uses AI to summarize something that they were supposed to have read themselves and without assistance, they're misperceiving that the assignment was not only a writing assignment in that case, but also a reading comprehension assignment. But if that's not made explicitly clear, then there's a misalignment of expectations. And so I think this approach that Chris is outlining here, and this is the Dear Families letter that he wrote to try to reinforce everyone's alignment around principles of citing your work and being transparent about the use of AI, and laying out a number of principles that everyone should follow in terms of the use of AI and what AI to use and so forth. I think, number one, transparency needs to be at a premium, especially at this moment. It's the role of leaders like Chris to make even more transparent the expectations around schoolwork, to communicate those, reinforce those, and come back to them whenever there's a question about what the expectations are and the transparency. The second thing that I think is a really interesting takeaway here that Chris talks about in his piece is that he actually went through the process himself of creating a gem. They used Gemini at a Science Leadership Academy, and he created a gem. And by creating that gem, he actually had to go through a lot of the programming, so to speak, of how the gem should behave. And I think this is a good exercise for any educator, anyone who's going to be working with students who are going to be using their AI, is the simple exercise might actually just be create the gem and give the gem for a purpose. It could be an academic purpose. Give it to a colleague and ask them to use it and watch how it behaves as they use it. This is a test case, a dry run to giving it to students. But I think the learnings here are tremendous in terms of what Chris is reflecting on, is needing to teach the AI, the gem, to do less and less of the work in a very deliberate way, and to watch as students can, or he himself as he was building it, can test it and see how all the different ways they can get around the rules, and ask, instead of a direct question, ask, can you give me an example, instead of asking for the gem to write the answer for this writing exercise as a capstone proposal exercise. There's lots of ways, and it's a sort of cat and mouse, a relentless cat and mouse game. And so I think that in this moment, the sort of putting the cards on the table is really the best way forward. So I would say two takeaways here. One, maintain transparency. If you haven't established it, start by establishing it. Take a look at Chris's letter to families. It's a good point to start from if you don't have that kind of open communication with families in your community, and obviously with your faculty and students. And then the second is to actually get involved yourself in creating some of these tools. And I think one of the things that's really useful about creating a gem, as opposed to just playing around with GPT, is because you then have to make some of the same creative decisions, that is, as a creator, as to how you want it to behave. What are the rules that it should abide by? And by experimenting with those rules and seeing the points of failure and where it needs further revision, I think there's no better way to really begin to understand how AIs are governed and how they've been trained, and then how you want to prepare them for classroom use, than to test it yourself and you can see how porous the boundaries are. Again, take a look at practicaltheory.org, Chris Lehman's blog from Science Leadership Academy, and I look forward to the next topic in our next episode. Thanks, everyone.